The air in the Kendrick mansion felt colder ever since the passing of Vincent Kendrick. The once vibrant halls that echoed with laughter and business negotiations now stood still, haunted by the pressure of decisions Cynthia Kendrick wasn't ready to face. The day after her father's burial, the family's lawyers sat her down, somber and formal, revealing the contents of the will. It was no ordinary inheritance. Her father had left her everything: the estate, the controlling shares in Kendrick Industries, and all assets tied to the Kendrick legacy. But there was a cruel condition attached. Cynthia had to marry within a year of his passing to assume full control. If she failed, the company and all her father had built would be passed to the board, and her step-uncle, Gerald, a greedy businessman with no moral compass, would take the helm. That clause, Vincent believed, would keep Cynthia focused on responsibility and help her find companionship, but to Cynthia, it felt like a trap cloaked in well-meaning intentions. Cynthia stared out from her father's office, watching as the sun cast long shadows on the estate's massive garden. The pressure was like an invisible shackle tightening around her throat. She had never been the woman obsessed with fairy tales or marriage. Her father, while loving and supportive, had been the only pillar in her life, especially since her mother died when she was 16. Marriage wasn't something she rushed into. She believed love had to be earned, not imposed. But here she was, 29 and 8 months into the deadline, with only 4 months left to find someone to marry. Her boyfriend Daniel had promised her they would marry when the time was right, and with the clock ticking, she believed that time was now. Yet Daniel seemed evasive, constantly distracted and vague about wedding plans. Still, she clung to hope, to the belief that the man she loved would stand by her when it mattered most. Despite the whispers of doubt creeping in, Cynthia tried to mask her growing unease. Every dinner with Daniel felt more distant than the last. He would show up late, his excuses polished and rehearsed, but his smile no longer reached his eyes. The worst part was the loneliness. Even in a room full of employees, advisors, and staff, Cynthia felt isolated. The pressure to keep everything together was immense, and every second the clock ticked, her father's legacy slipped further from her fingers. She missed his voice, his wisdom, the warmth of his guidance. The board meetings were turning hostile, with Gerald's influence increasing. He masked his greed with smiles and supportive words, but Cynthia saw the hunger in his eyes. She knew she had to act fast or risk losing everything her father worked for. Her only hope, she told herself over and over, was Daniel. He loved her, he had to. Anything else would be unthinkable. But in the quiet of her room, after the world went still, Cynthia allowed herself to cry. She would clutch her father's photograph and whisper promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She promised him she would protect the company, the employees, the foundation that bore her mother's name. But how could she marry without certainty? Was Daniel truly the one? Or was she being blinded by history and desperation? Her instincts had always been sharp in business, but when it came to love, she was lost. She looked at herself in the mirror and repeated, "I will not lose everything." Those words became her morning mantra. Little did she know, life was about to hand her heartbreak, betrayal, and the most unexpected love she'd ever imagined, hidden in the uniform of a security guard. The boardroom was stiff with tension as Cynthia took her seat at the head of the long, polished table. The board members, mostly middle-aged men with graying hair and calculating eyes, eyed her not with respect, but with silent doubt. Gerald Kendrick, her step-uncle, sat 2 seats away, his hands folded and his lips curled in a smirk that sent cold shivers down her spine. "Miss Kendrick," he began in his patronizing tone, "with only 4 months remaining, we sincerely hope you're making progress in fulfilling the requirements of your late father's will." Cynthia's jaw tightened. It was as if they expected her to fail, as if they were already planning how to divide the empire among themselves. She responded calmly, "The wedding plans are underway. Everything will be in place before the deadline." The murmurs around the table quieted. Gerald raised an eyebrow, unconvinced but amused. He leaned back and said nothing more, but Cynthia could read the message behind his silence. He thought she was bluffing. After the meeting, Cynthia retreated to her office, her thoughts racing. She needed Daniel to come through for her now more than ever. Their history was long. They had met in college and bonded over business dreams and ambition. He had been charming, attentive, and supportive, at least at first. In recent years, he had become less involved in her life, choosing instead to focus on his so-called ventures which he never seemed eager to share details about. Still, she told herself he was just ambitious, trying to build something of his own so he wouldn't be seen as living off her wealth. She respected that, or at least she used to. Now, the looming deadline cast shadows over all her faith in him. She picked up her phone and dialed his number. "We need to talk," she said when he picked up. "Can you come by tonight?" He hesitated before saying yes, which made her stomach sink a little more. That evening, Daniel arrived in his usual tailored suit, his cologne filling the room before he did. Cynthia offered him wine, which he accepted but didn't touch. His phone kept buzzing, and each time he glanced at it, he frowned. "Is something wrong?" she asked, forcing a smile. Daniel shook his head and finally said, "No, just business." Cynthia didn't press further. Instead, she brought up the topic that had been weighing on her heart. "I need us to start planning the wedding, now. The deadline is real, and the board is circling like vultures." Daniel nodded slowly, swirling the untouched wine. "Of course," he said, "I'm with you." But his tone was devoid of conviction. Cynthia clung to his words, trying to believe him, trying to convince herself that the man she had loved all these years wouldn't let her down when it mattered most. After he left, Cynthia sat in silence. Her fingers toyed with the engagement ring he had given her months ago, a modest diamond set in gold. She had cherished it, even though it wasn't flashy. But now, even the ring felt like a placeholder, a symbol of promises yet to be fulfilled. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the way he barely looked her in the eye anymore, or how his touch had grown colder. But she was running out of time and couldn't afford to let doubt derail everything. For her father's legacy, she had to push forward. For her future, she had to hope she wasn't being played. She didn't know it yet, but fate had already started setting a different path in motion, one where love, trust, and betrayal would collide in the most unexpected way. Daniel had once been everything Cynthia thought she needed: charming, smooth-talking, and full of wild dreams that matched hers. They met during her first year at university when he crashed an economics lecture he wasn't registered for just to flirt with her. That boldness had drawn her in, and soon they were inseparable. He told her he didn't care about her wealth, that he saw her for who she was beyond the last name and the headlines. Back then, when her father had frowned at their relationship, she had defended Daniel like a lioness. "He's different," she had said. "He loves me." Vincent Kendrick had eventually backed down, trusting his daughter's judgment. But if he could see things now, Cynthia wondered if her father would still believe she had chosen well. The years had changed them both. While Cynthia rose steadily within Kendrick Holdings, learning the ropes of leadership, Daniel wandered from one startup to the next, never sticking to anything long enough to succeed. Still, he always returned with honeyed words and plans for the next big thing. Cynthia, blinded by love and loyalty, had continued supporting him financially, quietly, discreetly, and without judgment. But lately, she had started wondering if she was the only one invested in their future. He was often absent from key family events, rarely showed interest in the company, and dismissed her worries with a casual kiss on the forehead. "You worry too much, CYN," he would say. "Everything will work out." But time was no longer on their side, and working out wasn't a strategy anymore. That weekend, Cynthia hosted a small garden brunch, inviting close friends and some members of the company's inner circle. Daniel arrived late, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast skies. He offered a quick kiss on her cheek, made a few jokes to the guests, then excused himself to take a call. Cynthia watched him from across the table, pretending to laugh with her guests but feeling a hollowness inside. When he returned, he offered no explanation. "Work," he said with a shrug. Later, when she asked him again about wedding dates, he deflected. "We'll do it right. No need to rush." But the rush wasn't about perfection, it was about survival, and she wished he could see that. That night, Cynthia curled up on her bed, scrolling through old pictures of them, smiling in Paris, holding hands on a yacht in Dubai, laughing in silly selfies. They looked like a couple that had it all. But pictures could lie. A part of her still believed Daniel was just stressed, distracted, maybe even scared of commitment. After all, marriage was a big step. But another part, the voice she'd kept buried for years, whispered a harder truth, that maybe Daniel was never in it for love at all. Maybe he had seen her as a ticket, a tool, a way to build his dreams. And if that voice was right, Cynthia knew she had more than just a heart to protect, she had a legacy. The sleek black car sat quietly in the shadows of the gated estate, a world away from the glamour Cynthia Kendrick lived in. Inside, Daniel reclined in the back seat, legs stretched, phone to his ear, while Rita sat beside him, lipstick smudged, wearing the same dress she had worn to Cynthia's brunch. "You think she suspects anything?" she asked, voice laced with nervous tension as she lit a cigarette. Daniel chuckled, his confidence disgustingly casual. "CYN? She's too wrapped around my finger to notice. All she sees is the guy she met in college, the broke dreamer who needed saving." Rita shifted uncomfortably, the weight of guilt pressing on her shoulders. "She's my best friend, Daniel. I feel like I'm losing my mind." Daniel reached over and caressed her thigh. "You're gaining freedom, baby. You're just too afraid to admit it." Rita turned away, staring out the window, hating herself for what she had become, a traitor to the woman who had given her everything. Daniel's phone buzzed again, another alert from his fraudulent investment schemes. Unknown to Cynthia, he had been running ghost companies under fake names, funneling money through dummy accounts, using her investments and connections to bait other investors. It wasn't just betrayal, it was fraud on a grand scale. His plan had always been the same: play the long game, marry her for access, then disappear with enough cash to last 5 lifetimes. But the wool had complicated things. The requirement to marry within a year forced his hand too soon, and he hated being rushed. "Maybe I'll just ditch her on the day," he muttered. Rita turned to him in horror. "Are you serious? You'd humiliate her like that?" Daniel sneered. "You think I care about her feelings? She's a means to an end. Let her cry in her mansion. She'll move on." Rita said nothing, but her heart ached. A part of her still loved Cynthia, even if her actions proved otherwise. As the car drove away, Rita leaned her head against the glass, remembering the years of sisterhood. Cynthia had stood up for her when she had nothing, paid her tuition, bought her clothes, supported her through heartbreaks and illness. And now, here she was, plotting with a man who only saw Cynthia's value in dollars and contracts. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Then don't. Walk away if you want. But you won't. Because deep down, you're just like me, you want the life she has." The word stung more than Rita cared to admit. Maybe he was right. Maybe her envy had blinded her. But now, the weight of what they were doing felt heavier than before. Cynthia was no fool, and if she found out, there would be no forgiveness. Rita swallowed hard. "She can never know," she said, more to herself than to him. Daniel simply smiled, his eyes cold and unreadable. "She won't. Not until it's too late." Back at the Kendrick estate, Cynthia lay asleep, unaware that the two people she trusted most had already drawn knives behind her back. In her dreams, her father appeared, warning her, standing at the gates of his empire with a stern face. "Protect what's mine," he told her, voice echoing through the fog. She woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing, breath short. Was it just grief, or something more? She stared at the engagement ring resting on her nightstand, now too loose on her finger, as if even it wanted to slip away. "I won't let you down, Daddy," she whispered into the darkness. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice had begun to whisper back, urging her to open her eyes before everything crumbled. Timothy Harry stood at his post near the east gate of the Kendrick estate, arms folded, eyes focused but thoughtful. From the outside, he was just another security guard dressed in a crisp navy uniform with a discreet badge and radio clipped to his belt. But beneath that uniform was a man whose net worth spanned continents, whose name graced Forbes lists, and whose decisions affected stock markets. Yet, none of the elites in this mansion knew who he was, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Years ago, Timothy had grown tired of gold diggers, boardroom politics, and false friendships. Too many women had fallen for his wealth, not his heart. So he created an alias, changed his appearance subtly, and began working as a security man at elite events, observing people in their rawest form, when they thought he was nobody. What better place to hide than in plain sight? He had been watching Cynthia Kendrick for weeks now. Not in a creepy or invasive way, but with the eyes of a man who saw someone drowning behind a perfect smile. She moved with grace, spoke with confidence, and commanded rooms like royalty, but there was sadness in her eyes, a heaviness in her walk. Timothy noticed how she paused before entering a room, how she hesitated before smiling, how she sat alone after meetings. Most would see a powerful heiress on the verge of marriage. Timothy saw a woman under siege by something invisible. And that made him curious. He had seen women like her before, pressured by legacy, deceived by charm, and admired by many but truly known by none. But unlike others, Cynthia didn't wear arrogance like armor. She spoke kindly to staff, never raised her voice unnecessarily, and once even helped a junior staffer carry boxes up the stairs. It was that small moment, so trivial to most, that had caught Timothy's heart off guard. She had knelt in her designer heels and lifted a box, ignoring the whispers of onlookers. "We're all humans," she had said. "No one is too big to help." That stayed with him. And though he didn't admit it aloud, he began volunteering for shifts around her side of the estate more often. Something about her reminded him of his mother, strong, proud, and often misunderstood. He had no idea what Cynthia's full story was, but he knew pain when he saw it, even when hidden behind diamond necklaces and silk gowns. And though he was committed to staying in disguise, he found himself silently hoping she'd notice him, not just as a guard, but as a man. Yet, Timothy kept his distance. He had been burned before, by socialites, heiresses, even women who promised to love him beyond his billions, only to crumble when he stripped away the luxury. It was why he started this strange habit of vanishing into common roles, testing people's character before revealing his truth. He hadn't planned on falling for anyone again, let alone a woman caught in the middle of inheritance wars. But Cynthia Kendrick had something different, a kind of quiet nobility. And as he stood under the security booth's low lighting, watching her from afar, he wondered if fate had led him here for more than just observation. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one hiding behind a mask. Behind the walls of a humble apartment on the outskirts of Lagos, Timothy's real life lay carefully tucked away. The studio was modest, wooden floors, warm lighting, basic furnishings, but everything in it was a facade. Hidden behind the walls was a high-tech vault containing documents, bank accounts, passports, and keys to properties scattered across continents. A simple fingerprint on a wall panel revealed the truth: Timothy Harry was no ordinary man. Born Timothy Chukwuemeka Edwards, heir to a powerful business dynasty, he had taken a different path after watching his family fall apart due to greed and betrayal. His father had died trying to expand too fast, and his mother had warned him, "Don't let money make your decisions. Let your heart guide you." That advice stayed with him through the years. Despite inheriting billions after his father's death, Timothy became disillusioned with wealth and society. He watched women throw themselves at him, corporations fake loyalty, and even family members turn against one another. It was in that chaos that he found clarity. He needed to find someone who loved him for him, not his empire, not his assets, but the man behind the name. So he disguised himself, using his security agency as a front. He took shifts at high-profile homes and events, playing the role of the invisible protector. Most people ignored him, which suited him fine. But every once in a while, someone surprised him. And now, that someone was Cynthia Kendrick. Back at the estate, his colleagues thought of him as the quiet one, always punctual, never nosy, respectful, and reserved. He kept his radio volume low, never engaged in gossip, and politely declined the invitations to drink or flirt with the female staff. He wasn't here for social activity. He was studying the elite, and in that study, Cynthia had become his central focus. Her kindness had drawn him in, and the way she carried herself with dignity even when others underestimated her stirred something deep within him. She wasn't like the others he had met, vain, arrogant, spoiled. Cynthia seemed to be trapped in a golden cage of expectations, and Timothy knew exactly what that felt like. They were from different worlds, yet both were chained by legacy and the burdens that came with power. One evening, as he walked past the garden and saw Cynthia seated alone by the fountain, tears glistening in her eyes, something in him stirred uncontrollably. He wanted to approach, to say something comforting, but his role stopped him. So he simply passed by with a soft "Good evening, Ma," and continued walking. But Cynthia looked up at the sound of his voice, just briefly. Their eyes met. For the first time, she truly noticed him. Not as security. Not as background noise. But as a man. And though neither spoke more than those 3 words, something shifted. That moment would echo into the days ahead, eventually changing both their lives forever. The morning sun cast long beams over the Kendrick estate as Cynthia sat in her office, calendar in hand, counting the weeks remaining. 4 months had dwindled down to 6 weeks, and each day felt like a pebble dropped into a deepening well of panic. Her father's legal advisor had called again, gently reminding her of the approaching deadline outlined in the will. If she wasn't married by the specified date, all of Vincent Kendrick's personal holdings and controlling shares would pass to the board. She didn't need reminding, she lived with the pressure every single day. Cynthia had always been decisive in business, but love had no logic, and Daniel's lukewarm attitude was turning that pressure into pure anxiety. Her calls to Daniel went unanswered for hours now, and when he finally did respond, it was usually through one-word texts. She made excuses for him, told herself he was stressed with business ventures or afraid of commitment. But the excuses were starting to feel like lies she told herself just to breathe. With 6 weeks left, Cynthia threw herself into the wedding plans. She met with decorators, cake designers, florists, and stylists, doing everything by herself. Daniel missed 3 meetings in 1 week, and each time he blamed traffic, headaches, or sudden business emergencies. Still, she tried to believe in him. After all, this was the man she had loved since university, the man who knew her before her name carried weight. But the problem was, he also knew her vulnerabilities. She had confided in him about the pressure her father had placed on her with the will. She had revealed how scared she was of Gerald taking over. Daniel knew everything, and maybe, she feared, he was using it against her. The thought made her chest tighten, but she pushed it aside. She had to believe in someone, or she'd crumble. Meanwhile, Timothy watched everything unfold from a distance. He noticed how Cynthia's posture had changed, how her shoulders drooped slightly when she thought no one was looking. He saw how she forced herself to smile when guests visited and how quickly that smile faded the moment they turned away. Timothy had been around enough power-hungry people to recognize manipulation. Something wasn't right with her fiancé. On more than one occasion, he had seen Daniel arrive late to the estate, eyes darting, phone glued to his hand. The man barely acknowledged Cynthia, and once, Timothy saw him flirting with one of the junior maids while Cynthia entertained guests in the lounge. It made his blood boil, not just because of the disrespect, but because Cynthia didn't deserve this. She had built herself around loyalty and legacy, and here she was, wasting time on a man who didn't see her worth. One quiet evening, as Cynthia sat in the courtyard alone, Timothy passed by and paused. She looked up and gave him a faint smile. "Nice night," she said. He nodded. "Yes, Ma, it is." She looked away, and for a moment, he almost said something more, but held back. He couldn't interfere, not yet. But as he continued on his path, he made a silent vow, if ever the moment came, if ever she truly needed someone, he wouldn't hesitate. For now, he would remain the watcher. But not forever. Because something inside him told him, her story wasn't meant to end in heartbreak. Not if he could help it. The following week brought a visit from Cynthia's godmother, Lady Marian Peters, a regal woman in her 60s with a sharp tongue and a heart full of wisdom. She had been her mother's closest friend and had helped raise Cynthia after the death of both parents. When she arrived at the Kendrick estate, her presence lit up the drawing room, and the staff straightened at the sight of her. Cynthia welcomed her with open arms, grateful for any comforting voice amidst the storm that was now her life. As they sipped tea by the window, Marian didn't waste time. "Cynthia, my dear, are you sure about this Daniel boy?" she asked, her brows arching with suspicion. Cynthia paused mid-sip, her smile faltering. "He's complicated," she admitted. Marian nodded slowly. "Complicated is fine, child. Deceptive is not." Lady Marian had seen men like Daniel in her time, charming, ambitious, and emotionally detached. "He's writing your name," she said bluntly. "I can feel it. He wants the Kendrick legacy, not you." Cynthia winced. "You don't know him like I do," she replied softly, eyes lowering. But even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction. Marian reached for her hand. "I may not know his heart, but I know your eyes. You're fading, Cynthia. You've lost weight. You're quieter. That's not love, it's fear. And if your father were alive, he would never let this happen. The words stung, but they were true. Cynthia blinked back tears. I have no choice, Marion. If I don't marry him, I lose everything my father built. Her voice trembled with vulnerability. But what if there's someone else? Marion asked gently. Someone who loves you for you? Cynthia scoffed, forcing a laugh. Where would I even find such a person? I'm surrounded by people who want something from me. Her voice cracked with exhaustion. Every man sees my name before they see me. Every friend has expectations. And Daniel. Daniel is all I have left of something I once believed in. Marion nodded with understanding, but a cloud of sadness hung between them. She knew Cynthia was trapped, emotionally, socially, and legally. But she also knew one thing: a woman with a heart as strong as Cynthia's didn't need to settle for pain in the name of legacy. That night, Marion walked to her car with a heavy heart. She glanced back at the estate, its walls glowing under the soft light. Somewhere inside, Cynthia stood by her window, staring into the darkness. And somewhere in the shadows, a man in a security uniform stood silently, watching over her. Marion didn't know it yet, but that man would be the one to catch Cynthia when everything else fell apart. Sometimes fate doesn't arrive in a limousine. Sometimes it walks quietly, dressed in a uniform, hiding billions behind a badge. The days that followed Lady Marion's visit passed in an uneasy blur for Cynthia. Her instincts were beginning to betray her. Where she once found comfort in Daniel's presence, she now felt unease, like standing on a cliff's edge, waiting for it to crumble. She tried not to notice the way he barely returned her texts or how he deflected any serious discussion about wedding logistics. She told herself he was busy, that stress was weighing on him too. But even lies get tired. One afternoon, as she reviewed floral arrangements with a planner, Daniel barged into her home office unannounced, phone in hand, arguing with someone about fake accounts and a delay in transfer. When she called his name, he froze, muttered a quick excuse, and kissed her forehead as though nothing had happened. Cynthia stood frozen in place, disturbed not by what she heard, but by how familiar it felt to be brushed aside. Later that night, she sat in the master suite, looking at herself in the mirror. Her eyes, once radiant with optimism, were dimmed with doubt. She remembered the days when she and Daniel would laugh under the stars, dreaming about a future far removed from the corporate stress of her father's world. Where had that version of him gone? Or worse, had he ever truly existed? As she ran a brush through her hair, her phone buzzed with a message from one of the staff. Attached was a photo, Daniel, outside the estate, laughing and leaning into a woman's ear. Though the image was grainy, the woman's figure was unmistakable. Rita. Her best friend. Cynthia's hand trembled as she set the phone down. Her stomach knotted with confusion, pain, and an eerie sense of confirmation. The voices in her head had not been wrong. She had been ignoring them all along. But still, she hesitated. She didn't want to confront him without certainty, without giving herself a reason to believe there could still be another explanation. She took the photo and went to her private security team, asking for any more unusual behavior logged around Daniel or Rita. They hesitated, uncomfortable with the request, but eventually agreed. Later that evening, Timothy overheard whispers of Cynthia's inquiry. While the other guards thought it was just another rich woman tantrum, he saw it differently. He recognized the pain in Cynthia's silence, the calculated way she tried to hide how betrayed she felt. And it burned inside him. That night, he walked past her again, offering his standard good evening. She looked up, eyes weary, but forced a small smile. Evening, she whispered back, voice barely audible. There was no need for more words. In that moment, he saw something break behind her gaze. As Timothy returned to his room, he sat on the edge of his small bed, clenching his fists. He hadn't intended to get involved. He had promised himself he'd remain a ghost, unseen, untouched, uninvolved. But the truth was, he was beginning to care too deeply. He wanted to protect her, not just as a man or a hidden billionaire, but as someone who had seen the depths of her humanity. He hadn't met many women who treated the janitors and drivers with as much dignity as CEOs. Cynthia was rare, and if someone didn't intervene soon, she'd be dragged deeper into a relationship that wasn't just loveless, it was dangerous. The question now wasn't whether Timothy would step in. It was when. The morning air was fresh with the scent of blooming lilies as Cynthia stepped into the courtyard. The day had started early for her, another appointment with the wedding planner, more calls with her father's legal team, and the endless pressure of the looming deadline. She needed a moment to breathe. Her silk robe clung to her gently in the breeze as she walked barefoot on the damp stone, letting the coolness calm her nerves. Though she had tried to reassure herself that everything was going as planned, something within her still fluttered with unrest. Daniel had promised to finalize the invitation list this week, but he'd been too busy with meetings. Still, she brushed the doubts aside. He was trying, she told herself. He just had a lot on his plate. They were getting married, this was the storm before the calm. She found a quiet bench beneath the old fountain her father had imported from Italy, a place she often visited when she needed peace. Her thoughts drifted to memories of her father, his strong presence, his laughter echoing through the garden, and how he used to sit exactly where she was now, sipping his morning coffee and giving her advice about life and business. She missed him deeply, especially now. He would have known how to steady her heart. She looked down at her engagement ring, twirling it slightly. It gleamed in the morning sun, and though small compared to what many expected of a woman of her status, it was meaningful. Daniel had given it to her during a quiet dinner, promising her a future filled with love. She had believed every word. Still did. She had to. Across the courtyard, Timothy was just completing his patrol shift when he noticed her sitting there. She looked delicate, almost lost in thought, the powerful CEO's daughter suddenly just a woman with worries. He hesitated, unsure if he should interrupt, but something urged him to walk over. As he approached, she turned her head. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was no barrier between heiress and guard, just two people acknowledging each other's existence. "Good morning, Ma," he greeted with a gentle nod. Cynthia smiled faintly. "Good morning. You don't always have to say Ma, you know. I have a name." Timothy smiled modestly. "Yes, but saying your name out loud would be too bold for someone in my position." Cynthia raised an eyebrow, amused by his humility. "Well then, just for today, pretend you're not in that position." They talked for a few minutes, about the weather, the garden, the hectic preparations she was managing. It felt strange, talking casually with someone so far outside her world, but also comforting. Timothy listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words were simple but thoughtful. "You seem tired," he said gently. Cynthia sighed. "It's a lot to carry. Sometimes I wish I could just disappear for a day and be someone no one expects anything from." Timothy looked at her with quiet understanding. Even the strongest people need a place to set their burdens down, even if only for a moment. His voice was calm, grounding. Cynthia found herself smiling. She didn't know why, but this conversation, however brief, eased something inside her. When she rose to leave, she glanced back at him. "Thank you, Timothy." "Really?" He gave her a small nod. "Anytime." Cynthia. Cynthia sat in the study, her pen hovering over a checkbook, uncertainty gnawing at her confidence. Daniel had called again earlier, claiming an urgent business deal had fallen through due to a cash flow hiccup. He asked for a short-term loan, 3 million naira, to help him secure a new contract that would strengthen their future together. Cynthia tried to push back, asking for details, requesting documents, anything to justify the request. But Daniel became frustrated, guilt-tripping her with sharp words about trust and loyalty. "After all we've been through, you're going to question me over money?" he had snapped. Cynthia, unwilling to escalate an argument, eventually relented and wrote the check. But her hand trembled as she signed it. It wasn't about the money, it was about the pattern. More and more, Daniel's love seemed conditional, his affections tied to transactions. Each time he smiled, it felt thinner, like a salesman's charm, not a lover's warmth. Later that evening, she met with her wedding planner to finalize the reception details, but her heart wasn't in it. She nodded and signed forms, barely listening to the descriptions of floral arches and imported roses. Her mind kept wandering to Daniel. Where was he now? Why hadn't he returned her call after she transferred the money? Her doubts simmered just below the surface, but she pushed them down, convincing herself that things would settle once the wedding passed. Timothy, meanwhile, happened to be stationed near the garden and caught a glimpse of her as she paced the length of the walkway, phone in hand. Her voice was soft, tired, and frustrated. "Daniel, please call me back. I need to discuss the guest list again." Timothy tilted his head slightly, trying not to eavesdrop but finding himself unable to pull away. After her call went unanswered for the third time that evening, Cynthia sat alone on the terrace, arms folded across her chest. She replayed moments from their past, how he used to hold her face in his hands and tell her he believed in her. She wanted to believe those words still meant something. But lately, they felt like echoes from a different version of him, a version she missed deeply. A maid walked past and offered her a cup of tea. Cynthia smiled, thanked her softly, and returned to her thoughts. She didn't want to seem weak, especially not in front of her staff, who always looked up to her with admiration. She had a legacy to protect, a name to uphold, and the memory of her father to honor. But more than that, she had a heart that was slowly, silently breaking under the weight of misplaced trust. Unbeknownst to her, Timothy observed the way she wrapped her arms around herself, how she forced a smile for the maid, and how she glanced toward the main gates, as if hoping someone would walk through them to reassure her. He clenched his jaw. It was getting harder to watch from a distance. Every fiber of his being wanted to approach her, not as a guard, but as a man who saw her worth far beyond her name. He whispered to himself, if only she knew. But now wasn't the time to reveal his truth. She still had faith in Daniel. And Timothy respected her enough to let her find her own way, until she was ready to see things as they truly were. The morning sun bathed the Kendrick estate in gold as Timothy slipped into his uniform, adjusting the collar with practiced ease. He had grown used to the rhythm of this new life, structured shifts, quiet observations, polite nods. But lately, it was getting harder to remain detached. Every time he caught a glimpse of Cynthia, her presence seemed to stir something unfamiliar in him, a longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. She walked with a regal elegance, but her eyes, those eyes, often carried shadows that betrayed her true emotions. They haunted him. Not because she looked broken, no, Cynthia Kendrick was far from fragile. But because behind the strength, he saw someone quietly drowning, trying to keep everything afloat on her own. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted to carry some of that weight for her. His assistant Gideon had called the night before, reminding him of postponed meetings, pending investor calls, and invitations to business summits. "You've been gone for over a month, sir," Gideon said. "The board is starting to worry." Timothy leaned back on his small couch, sighing deeply. "Let them worry," he replied. "I'm still observing something important." Gideon was used to these phases, Timothy's disappearances into ordinary roles to steady people, search for sincerity, and find something real in a world that worshipped status. But this time was different. Timothy wasn't just observing, he was feeling. And the thought both intrigued and terrified him. Cynthia had no idea who he was, and yet she'd shown him more respect and kindness than women who knew the weight of his name. And that meant more than she could ever imagine. Later that day, Timothy found himself posted near the south veranda where Cynthia was reviewing wedding logistics with a planner. He watched as she discussed color themes and reception setups, her tone calm but her posture tense. Daniel was nowhere in sight, again. After the meeting, Cynthia stayed behind, scribbling notes in her planner. Timothy, resisting the urge to intervene, turned to leave, until she looked up and caught his gaze. "Timothy, right?" she called gently. He turned. "Yes, Ma," she smiled. "You always seem to appear when things feel overwhelming." Timothy gave a polite nod, but inside, he felt his chest tighten. "Just doing my duty, Ma," she tilted her head. "Well, thank you. It helps, more than you know." There was a pause, a quiet, charged silence where two very different worlds acknowledged each other. That evening, Timothy stood by the window of his quarters, staring into the garden below. He had no right to feel what he was feeling. Cynthia was preparing to marry another man, and he was supposed to be nothing more than background noise in her world. But emotions didn't follow rules. And something deep inside him, something far more honest than titles or wealth, wanted to be part of her life. Not because of who she was on paper, but because of who she was in the stolen moments when no one was watching. He sighed and whispered to the stars, "If only you saw what I see in you." But for now, he would keep his distance. Because love, like truth, had its own time. The spa day was a breath of fresh air, at least on the surface. Cynthia had planned it weeks in advance, envisioning a time when she and her bridal party could escape the weight of wedding planning and simply enjoy each other's company. The scent of rosewater and lavender filled the private suite, and soft music played in the background as the women laughed over champagne and soaked their feet in warm milk baths. Rita was, as always, the life of the group, chatty, engaging, always quick with a joke or compliment. She handed Cynthia a flute of sparkling apple juice and nudged her playfully. "Your skin is glowing, future Mrs. Kendrick," she said with a grin. Cynthia smiled, though her heart felt unusually tight. She didn't know why, but there was a subtle shift in the air between them, something that didn't quite sit right. The feeling had started days ago. It was nothing concrete, just a pattern, small, barely noticeable things. Like how Rita had suddenly become vague about her whereabouts. Or how she always seemed to answer calls in private now, stepping out of rooms to speak in hushed tones. Earlier that day, Cynthia had returned from a fitting appointment to find Rita quickly ending a call and tucking her phone away. "Just the decorator," she had said cheerfully, but Cynthia had noticed the way her hand shook slightly. She brushed the thought aside then, blaming wedding nerves. But now, as she sat watching Rita joke with the other bridesmaids, her laughter felt just a little too loud, her smile a little too forced. It was probably nothing. But it was also something. Later, when Cynthia stepped into the hallway to take a call from her godmother, she passed by an open storage closet. Inside, she saw Rita facing away, talking softly into her phone. Cynthia paused, only hearing a few words. "No, I haven't told her." "Not yet." "Just wait." Her heart skipped. Rita didn't see her, and Cynthia didn't linger. She stepped away before she could hear more, unsure whether to be alarmed or embarrassed. Maybe Rita was planning a surprise bridal shower. Maybe she was talking about someone else entirely. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it curled inside her like a question mark she couldn't straighten out. When she returned to the lounge, Rita was back in her seat, laughing with another bridesmaid. "Where did you sneak off to?" she asked. Cynthia forced a smile. "Just a quick call." As the day ended and the ladies departed one by one, Cynthia found herself sitting quietly on the spa couch, fingering the rim of her glass. Rita came over and offered a shoulder massage, her tone sweet as ever. "You okay, babe?" Cynthia nodded, but her thoughts were far away. That night, alone in her room, she scrolled through old pictures of them, her and Rita at university, on vacation, at birthday parties. They had been inseparable once. Sisters in all but blood. And now, for the first time, Cynthia felt unsure. She didn't have proof, not yet. But the silence between them no longer felt like comfort. It felt like a door slowly closing, and she was afraid of what she might find behind it. Cynthia stood by the French doors of her suite, watching the horizon as dusk settled over the Kendrick estate. The sky was awash in warm streaks of amber and purple, a perfect picture of calm, yet her heart thudded with quiet unrest. Daniel had canceled yet another dinner. They were supposed to finalize their honeymoon itinerary together. His excuse this time was a sudden investor meeting that couldn't wait. Cynthia didn't argue. She simply nodded over the phone and ended the call politely. But inside, a different conversation was taking place. One where her heart whispered truths she didn't want to hear. Daniel's excuses had become predictable, his presence increasingly optional. And though she wore his ring, she couldn't help but wonder if she was the only one still holding onto the idea of us. Despite the growing discomfort, Cynthia pushed forward with the wedding preparations. The dress fittings, the floral arrangements, the catering, every detail meticulously reviewed and approved. The estate buzzed with activity, yet she felt more alone than ever. Her staff praised her dedication, calling her a vision of elegance and poise. But none of them knew how heavy her smile had become. She began to second-guess her choices more often. Was she marrying Daniel because of love, or because she felt chained to the legacy her father left behind? The deadline for the inheritance loomed, and her sense of urgency blurred her judgment. She wasn't just marrying a man, she was securing an empire. That pressure, compounded with Daniel's growing absence, made her feel like a prisoner of her own life. Timothy, meanwhile, continued to keep a respectful distance, but his internal conflict worsened. Each day, he saw her shrink a little more beneath the weight of forced joy. Her interactions with him were always kind, always dignified, but there was a subtle shift. Her eyes lingered longer, her words softened, her gratitude more genuine. Once, while walking past him after an evening stroll, she stopped and said, "You're the only one who still sees me." The statement caught him off guard. He wanted to say more, to ask her what she meant, but she had already continued walking, leaving him in stunned silence. That night, Timothy stared at the ceiling of his apartment, the fan above casting slow-moving shadows on the wall. He couldn't keep hiding. Not forever. But he also couldn't step in and break something that hadn't completely cracked. Not yet. In her private moments, Cynthia began journaling again, a habit she had dropped years ago. She wrote about fear, about trust, about the fine line between loyalty and self-betrayal. Her pages filled with questions she couldn't ask out loud. Did Daniel still love her? Was Rita hiding something? Why did Timothy's presence feel safer than Daniel's embrace? She didn't have the answers, but the questions themselves were enough to rattle her foundation. And though the wedding date inched closer, Cynthia found herself silently pleading for clarity, not just for her father's sake, not for the empire, but for her heart. She didn't want to walk down the aisle wearing doubts like perfume. But in the silence, all she could do was choose, and hope she chose right. Timothy paced the floor of his modest apartment, a rare sight for someone usually so composed. He had spent years mastering the art of restraint, listening more than speaking, watching more than acting. But lately, his feelings for Cynthia had begun to stretch the boundaries of that control. He watched her move through the days like a shadow of herself, smiling for cameras, making decisions, giving instructions, yet there was always a sadness behind her eyes. A sadness he wanted to remove. That morning, he'd nearly confessed everything. When she passed by the gates after her morning jog and stopped to offer him a bottle of water with a soft "thank you for always being around," he had felt the words press against his chest, "I'm not who you think I am." But he couldn't say it, not while she still wore Daniel's ring with hope. Later that day, Timothy called his assistant, Gideon. "I might need to accelerate the timeline," he said, staring out the window of the estate's garden shed. Gideon sighed. "Sir, you've been in disguise too long. What are you waiting for? If she's the one, show her the truth." Timothy didn't respond immediately. How could he explain the delicacy of the situation? Cynthia wasn't some socialite to impress with private jets and penthouses. She was someone who had been burned before, someone whose trust had become a fragile glass. He needed her to love him for who he was beneath the billions. He needed her to choose him as Timothy, the man who watched from the shadows, not the mogul hiding behind the badge. But fate, it seemed, was toying with him. That evening, as Cynthia walked alone through the rose garden, Timothy gathered the courage to approach her. "Ma." "Cynthia," he corrected himself, voice low and careful. She turned, surprised. "Yes?" He hesitated. "Have you ever thought? Maybe the person you're meant to be with isn't the one you planned for?" Cynthia blinked, her breath catching at the depth behind his line. There was a silence between them. Timothy looked into her eyes, and for the briefest moment, he almost reached for her hand. But she stepped back first, polite yet distant. "Thank you for your kindness, Timothy. But some choices we make with our heads, not our hearts." As she walked away, Timothy felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. It wasn't a rejection of love, at least not yet. It was the fear of consequences, the fear of letting go of what she thought she needed to protect. And he understood that. Cynthia was not a woman who took leaps without looking. She was bound by duty, by the memory of a father whose name she carried like a crown. For now, Timothy would remain in the background. But a storm was coming, one that would strip away every lie, every illusion. And when it did, she would have to decide who to run to. He only prayed it wouldn't be too late. 2 days later, Cynthia found herself wandering the upper hallway of the East Wing, an area usually reserved for visiting executives and dignitaries. She was looking for a folder she'd mistakenly left in one of the guest suites after a board review. As she passed by one of the doors, slightly ajar, she heard Daniel's voice, sharp and low. "You're overthinking it, Rita. She's not going to find out." Cynthia froze. Her breath caught as she leaned gently against the wall, hidden just beyond the doorway. "I just don't feel right," Rita's voice followed, laced with anxiety. "She's not stupid. If she catches on before the wedding, we're both done. Daniel chuckled. Let her focus on flowers and vows. By the time she wakes up, we'll be long gone, with a slice of the empire. Cynthia's heart thudded like a war drum, and for a moment, she felt her knees weaken beneath her. But then, as a phone rang inside the room, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the door. She quickly stepped away, making it appear as though she had only just arrived in the hall, folder in hand. Daniel opened the door seconds later, startled but composed. Babe, he said, faking a warm smile. What are you doing up here? Cynthia forced herself to remain calm. Just retrieving something. You? Daniel shrugged. Making a quick call to the decorator. You know how last-minute things are. She nodded slowly, her face neutral, but inside her thoughts raced. Something didn't add up. And now, she was certain the walls of her reality were hiding secrets she hadn't yet dared to name. Still, she couldn't jump to conclusions, not without evidence. That night, she tried to focus on finalizing the seating chart but found herself staring at blank cards, her thoughts circling back to what she heard. She considered confiding in someone, Lady Marian, perhaps, but part of her feared the truth. If she opened that door, she couldn't close it again. And if she confronted Daniel prematurely, he'd twist it. He always did. So instead, she waited. Observed. Watched how he spoke to the staff, how Rita avoided her gaze. She began to gather small pieces of inconsistencies, like breadcrumbs leading her to a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to find. Timothy noticed the shift immediately. Cynthia looked composed, but he recognized the tension in her shoulders, the way she carried herself with just a touch more distance. One evening, as she passed him by the back garden, she paused briefly. If you thought someone was hiding something from you, would you confront them immediately? Or wait until you were sure? Timothy's eyes searched hers, surprised by the vulnerability in the question. It depends, he answered. If the lie could destroy everything, I'd wait. But I'd watch closely. People show their true selves when they think you're not looking. Cynthia gave a faint nod. That's what I was afraid you'd say. And with that, she walked away again, leaving Timothy staring after her, heartbreaking for the storm he knew was drawing near. With only a week left before the wedding, the Kendrick estate transformed into a flurry of orchestrated chaos. Every corner of the grounds was overtaken by decorators, florists, and catering teams, all bustling to meet perfection. Chandeliers were cleaned until they sparkled like stardust, the garden's rose arches were reinforced with fairy lights, and the estate's guest wing prepared for international dignitaries and board members. Cynthia moved through it all like a practiced conductor, offering input, correcting errors, and giving polite smiles to those who asked for her opinion. But inside, she was a storm barely contained in a glass jar. Each day that passed without Daniel's active participation pushed another needle into her heart. His lack of engagement was no longer something she could ignore, it screamed at her with every unanswered text and every meeting he missed. Despite her growing suspicion, Cynthia refused to cancel anything. If she did, she feared it would confirm everything she was beginning to believe, and once confirmed, it could not be undone. So instead, she leaned into the illusion, hoping maybe the truth she feared would stay hidden until after the ceremony. Daniel arrived occasionally, always with a fabricated excuse and a soft kiss on her cheek. He never stayed long, and he never asked questions about the plans. He behaved like a guest in a movie he didn't care to watch. Cynthia smiled for the photographers, nodded during interviews, and gave the board no reason to doubt her readiness. But in the stillness of night, when the last light was out and only the hum of the security system remained, she stared at the ceiling and prayed, for peace, for guidance, and for truth. Timothy watched it all unfold from the sidelines, his heart sinking with each passing day. He hated seeing her walk alone through the estate gardens while Daniel came and went like a ghost. It pained him to hear her giving directions to vendors while her groom was nowhere in sight. And yet, Timothy said nothing. He had no proof, no right to interfere. His role as a guard bound him in place, even as the man inside him screamed to protect her. One evening, as Cynthia stood alone on the balcony overlooking the ballroom, Timothy approached from a distance. "You've built something beautiful," he said quietly. She turned to him, surprised, but smiled. "It doesn't feel beautiful inside. Sometimes it feels like it's all just paper walls waiting for a spark." Her words hit him harder than she knew. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but she was already walking away. That night, Timothy stayed awake well past midnight, pacing his room, questioning everything. What would it cost to reveal himself now? Would she believe him if he exposed Daniel? Could he prove his intentions weren't born out of jealousy or pride? His hands clenched into fists. He couldn't wait forever. But he also knew Cynthia needed to see it for herself. When the walls finally came down, he would be there, not to say, "I told you so," but to catch her. Because despite everything, she was the only truth he'd found in years of living behind a mask. Cynthia sat at her father's old desk, rifling through an old leather box of personal items, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, even a photo of him standing with her as a child in front of Kendrick Holdings headquarters. She missed his strength, his clarity. Vincent Kendrick had been many things, demanding, brilliant, traditional, but he had always loved her fiercely. And right now, she needed that love. The pressure from the board had intensified. Gerald had already started circling like a vulture, suggesting preemptive shifts in board seats in case the wedding fell through. It was a cruel tactic, and one designed to push her over the edge. Cynthia didn't let them see her flinch, but each conversation drained her strength like a slow leak in a sinking boat. The wedding wasn't just a ceremony anymore, it was survival. Later that evening, as the estate settled into silence, Cynthia returned to the balcony where she had spoken with Timothy days earlier. She didn't expect to see him again so soon, but as if summoned by fate, he emerged from the shadows of the corridor, nodding politely. "You again," she said with a tired smile. "Do you ever sleep?" Timothy shrugged. "Not when something's bothering me." She tilted her head, curious. "What's bothering you now?" He looked at her for a long moment. Seeing someone hold the weight of the world alone. His words, though simple, struck a chord. Cynthia lowered her gaze. "I don't have the luxury of falling apart." Timothy hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded note. "If ever you find yourself needing someone, not a groom, not a business partner, just someone real, open this." He handed it to her without explaining further. Cynthia took it with both hands, surprised. "What is this?" she asked. "Just a truth you may need one day," he said before walking away, leaving her staring at the folded paper like it held the answer to a riddle she didn't know she'd been asking. She didn't open it, yet. But she slipped it into her pocket and clutched it as though it were a lifeline. She didn't know why, but in that moment, Timothy's words felt more sincere than anything Daniel had said in weeks. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Cynthia didn't think of flower arrangements or designer gowns. She thought of Timothy's voice, steady and quiet. Of the way he never tried to impress her, never forced his presence. And of the way he saw her, not as an heiress, not as a bride-to-be, but as a woman trying her best to hold it all together. The note rested beside her on the nightstand, unopened but powerful. She hadn't yet accepted that she might need it. But deep down, a part of her already knew, truth had a way of revealing itself. And when it did, it never knocked gently. Rita couldn't sleep. The luxury apartment Daniel had rented for her downtown, once a symbol of triumph, now felt more like a prison of secrets. She lay on the velvet couch, phone in hand, staring at her call history. Cynthia's name sat at the top, untouched. She hadn't called her friend in days, afraid that her voice would tremble or that guilt would leak through her words. The deeper she got into the plan, the heavier her heart grew. She had told herself it was harmless, just a little deception to escape poverty, to secure her future. Daniel had promised they'd vanish after the wedding, taking just enough from the Kendrick fortune to live comfortably abroad. But now, as she watched Cynthia smile on TV during a pre-wedding interview, her throat closed up. That woman was more than a friend. She had been her lifeline, her sister. And Rita was helping destroy her. The guilt didn't ease, even when Daniel tried to distract her with expensive gifts or whispered promises. "We're too deep in, Rita. Don't start catching feelings," he warned one night after she suggested backing out. "She won't know what hit her. We'll be gone before she even figures it out." But Rita did have feelings, guilt, regret, sorrow. She remembered the nights Cynthia had stayed up comforting her after heartbreaks, the money she had given her for tuition, the unconditional love. Betraying her felt like stealing from her own blood. Rita sat by the mirror, staring into her own eyes, wondering when she had stopped recognizing the woman she had become. She didn't even care about Daniel anymore. His charm had worn off. What remained was a creeping dread that everything was about to explode. She considered coming clean, but fear held her back. Daniel had threatened to ruin her if she backed out, said he had recordings and messages that could make it look like she masterminded the whole thing. "If I go down, you go first," he'd said with a cold smirk. So Rita stayed silent. But her silence was rotting her from the inside. She started avoiding Cynthia, claiming she was too busy with logistics to attend fittings or meetings. When they did meet, she forced a smile and spoke carefully, terrified Cynthia might notice the guilt in her eyes. And Cynthia. She was watching, even if she didn't say it aloud. The distance between them had grown. Something unspoken had taken root. And both women knew it, even if neither was ready to confront it. One evening, while Cynthia was reviewing guest placements in her office, Rita appeared at the door, uninvited and nervous. "I brought you those bridal favors you asked for," she said quietly. Cynthia looked up, nodded, and offered a seat. They sat in silence for a moment, the air thick between them. "You okay?" Cynthia finally asked. Rita nodded too quickly. "Just tired." Cynthia smiled gently, though her eyes lingered. "Me too." The moment passed, but something had cracked. After Rita left, Cynthia opened the drawer and stared at the folded note Timothy had given her. She still hadn't opened it, but it was beginning to feel like it wasn't just a lifeline. It was a ticking clock. The night before the wedding arrived cloaked in silver moonlight and suffocating anticipation. The Kendrick estate sparkled like a palace, with every detail prepped to perfection. From the imported orchids lining the walkways to the crystal arch erected in the center of the ballroom, it was the kind of event worthy of magazine covers. Guests had already begun to arrive, foreign investors, top executives, and longtime allies of the Kendrick family. Cynthia was a vision of composure as she greeted them, her gown for the evening rehearsal tailored to perfection. But inside, her chest tightened with each passing hour. The air smelled of roses and candle wax, but to her, it carried the scent of change, a change she couldn't quite name but could feel coming, like the silence before a storm. Her suite upstairs was quiet, the bustle of the estate muted behind its doors. Dresses hung neatly along the wall, her final fitting laid out for the morning. But Cynthia sat at the vanity, staring at her reflection. Her hair had been freshly styled, her nails manicured, her skin glowing, but none of it could mask the ache behind her eyes. She picked up the folded note Timothy had given her. Her fingers hovered over the crease, tempted to unfold it, read whatever truth lay inside. But once again, she stopped herself. She wasn't ready. She wanted to believe she had made the right choice, that Daniel would show up tomorrow, take her hand, and silence every doubt. But beneath that hope was a second voice, whispering, "What if he doesn't?" And worse. What if he never intended to? Timothy stood near the east gate, dressed in uniform, eyes following the procession of cars arriving. He hadn't been reassigned to her personal guard for the night, but he remained nearby anyway. His chest ached with the weight of knowing too much and saying too little. He hadn't seen her since the previous morning, but he'd heard murmurs among the staff, how quiet she had become, how distant. Gideon had called again, urging him to return to his real life, warning him that his absence was causing ripples. "One more day," Timothy said into the phone. "Just one more. Tomorrow, everything would either break apart or fall together." He didn't know which to hope for anymore. All he knew was this: if she fell, he'd be there to catch her. Cynthia finally climbed into bed as midnight approached, but sleep didn't come. She clutched the note again, now resting on her pillow, and turned toward the open balcony door where the curtains swayed gently in the night breeze. Somewhere out there, people celebrated her future, toasted to her love, marveled at her wealth. But here, in this quiet room, she lay wrapped in uncertainty. She whispered a single line into the dark: "Please let tomorrow be real." She closed her eyes, praying against the dread in her stomach. Little did she know, the next sunrise would unravel everything she believed. And the person she'd never expected would be the only one standing when the world she built finally cracked open. The morning sun broke over the Kendrick estate in a blaze of gold and brilliance, painting the sky with hues of hope and splendor. Everything was perfect. The florists had arrived at dawn, arranging the final blossoms along the aisle, while the bridal orchestra rehearsed a melody meant to melt hearts. The media had gathered outside the estate's gates, flashing cameras capturing guests in luxurious gowns and tuxedos. Inside, the staff worked tirelessly to ensure no detail was missed. This was the day society had been waiting for, the wedding of Cynthia Kendrick, heiress to the Kendrick empire. And yet, inside the bridal suite, the bride herself sat completely still, wrapped in a sea of white lace and silence. Cynthia stared at her reflection in the mirror, the final pins being set into her hair. Her makeup was flawless, her gown fitted to perfection, yet her heart felt like it belonged to someone else, someone smaller, someone less sure. Around her bustled assistants and stylists, all speaking in hushed tones and smiling as though their own lives depended on the success of this day. Rita stood in the corner, quiet, holding Cynthia's bouquet. The space between them was vast, despite the few feet separating them. Cynthia had said little to her friend that morning. There were things between them that hadn't yet been addressed, questions unspoken. Rita's eyes held guilt. Cynthia's held fear. And in the mirror, both of them looked like strangers to each other. Timothy stood stationed behind the estate's glass ballroom, eyes scanning the perimeter. He wasn't supposed to be on duty today, yet he had requested to remain close to the main event. He needed to be there, not as a security guard, not as a CEO, but as the man who had come to care for Cynthia more than he ever anticipated. All morning, he battled the urge to reveal the truth, to run to her side and tell her everything, about Daniel, about Rita, about who he really was. But he held himself back. Cynthia needed to see it for herself. She needed to choose, not be rescued. Still, something the smiles. Too much pressure behind the performance. And when silence screams loudest, it usually means the ground is about to shatter. Downstairs, the grand ballroom had been chairs lined the aisle, and violinists played soft, slow melodies. Guests filled the seats in anticipation. The officiant waited at the altar, flipping through his notes. All that was missing was the groom. Daniel. He was nowhere to be found. His phone rang endlessly. The doors of the ballroom opened slowly, and all eyes turned as Cynthia stood at the threshold, radiant in her wedding gown. Her veil was draped lightly over her face, and her arm linked with her godmother, Lady Marian, who was standing in for her late father. The aisle stretched before her like a path into the unknown, each step a blend of hope, doubt, and desperation. Guests rose to their feet, cameras clicked, and tears welled in the eyes of friends who had watched her grow from a grieving teenager into a powerful woman. But as she reached the halfway mark, a shiver of silence rippled through the crowd, because the altar was empty. The officiant cleared his throat and glanced nervously toward the entrance to the groom's waiting room. Murmurs began to rise among the guests. A few heads turned. The violinists faltered. Cynthia stopped in the middle of the aisle, her breath caught in her throat. She looked toward the stage, heart hammering, lips parting to speak, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. Everyone could see what was happening. Daniel was gone. The groom had disappeared. Rita, seated in the front row, buried her face in her hands, trembling visibly. Her shame had come crashing down. Cynthia looked straight at her, no words, no accusations, just a gaze heavy with realization. Everything she had feared was now unfolding before her in real time, and the walls around her, the legacy she had tried to protect, began to crack. The whispers became louder. A few guests began to shift awkwardly in their seats. Cynthia turned slowly toward the side door where Daniel should have entered from. A security guard ran up to the officiant and whispered something in his ear. The man's expression grew pale. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, we asked for a brief intermission. There has been a delay." But everyone knew it wasn't a delay. Member rushed over and placed a phone into her hand. It was a message. From Daniel. Her hands shook as she opened it. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation. It was a video. Her eyes scanned the screen, her face drained of color as she saw Daniel and Rita, betrayal. The ballroom remained silent except for the soft creaking of her heels against the head was high, but her heart had shattered. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply left, her silence louder than any storm. Cynthia stood in the privacy of her suite, still in her wedding gown, its beading glimmering under the harsh lighting as if mocking her. The silence was unbearable. She had stormed out of the ballroom with elegance, but now behind closed doors, the pain could no longer be hidden. Her hands trembled as she removed the veil and placed it gently on the vanity. The video still echoed in her mind, Daniel and Rita, laughing, intertwined, oblivious to the destruction their selfishness would cause. The betrayal was more than emotional. It was public, humiliating, and shattering. She had opened her heart and life to two people she had trusted with everything. Now they had turned her world upside down on the most significant day of her life. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but she willed herself not to cry. Not yet. Lady Marian burst in, her face ashen. She hurried to Cynthia, pulling her into her arms. For the first time in years, Cynthia allowed herself to be held like a child, like the orphan she had once been. "It's okay, my baby," Marian whispered. "Let it out. He doesn't deserve your tears, but you deserve to release this pain." Cynthia didn't wail or scream. Instead, silent tears poured down her face, soaking into Marian's dress. The room remained quiet, save for the occasional sniffle. Outside, the guests began to murmur more loudly, some slowly leaving, others lingering out of morbid curiosity. But inside that room, time had stopped. The illusion had been shattered, and all that remained was Cynthia, wounded, betrayed, but not broken. She pulled away slowly and looked at herself in the mirror. "He never intended to marry me," she whispered. "I was just convenient." Timothy, positioned by the hallway, had heard the news from a fellow guard. The moment he heard the grooms gone, he had rushed toward the suite but paused just short of the door. It wasn't his place, not yet. Still, he stood like a sentry, refusing to move. He had wanted to be wrong about Daniel. But now the truth was out, and Cynthia's world was unraveling. The note he had given her still weighed heavily in his mind. Had she read it? Did she remember he was there? He didn't want to burst into her life as a savior, but if there was ever a moment for her to see him clearly, it was now. When Lady Marian exited the room briefly, their eyes met. "She's devastated," she said quietly. "She needs someone who sees her. Not her name, not her empire. Just her." Inside, Cynthia stood alone once again. The makeup artists had left, the bridesmaids had disappeared, and even Rita hadn't dared to return. Her bouquet lay on the floor where she had dropped it. She stared at the broken petals and whispered, "What now?" Just then, a gentle knock came at the door. She opened it slowly, and there stood Timothy. Not in a rush. Not asking questions. Just there, with the same calm presence he had always shown her. "Do you need a friend?" he asked. Cynthia didn't speak. She only nodded. Because in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the gown. Not the legacy. Just the rare, quiet comfort of a man who had never pretended to be anything he wasn't. The estate had never been so quiet. After the guests had left and the music faded, a heavy stillness settled over the grand Kendrick mansion. Cynthia sat on the edge of the bed in her suite, still dressed in the remnants of her ruined wedding day, gown slightly wrinkled, hair undone, but dignity still intact. She stared at the clock. Midnight was only a few hours away. And with its arrival, the clause in her father's will would activate. If she wasn't legally married before the day ended, she would lose the empire he built. The thought was suffocating. Not because of the money, but because she knew what her father had endured to build Kendrick Holdings. Losing it to Gerald and the greedy board members would mean letting his legacy slip into unworthy hands. She couldn't allow that. But she had no groom. And no time. Her hands clenched into fists, and tears stung her eyes once again. A knock came at the door. Cynthia turned slowly, hoping for calm but expecting more chaos. When she opened it, she found Timothy standing there, still in uniform, still with that same calm aura. "You shouldn't be alone," he said gently. She stepped aside, wordlessly letting him in. As he entered, he noticed the documents scattered on her desk, legal contracts, a framed photo of her father, and a copy of the will. He turned to her with quiet curiosity. "You're still holding on to the company," he observed. She nodded. "If I don't get married by midnight, I lose it. Everything he built." Everything he gave his life for. Her voice cracked. I was supposed to protect it. Timothy remained still for a moment, then stepped closer. Then let me help you protect it. Cynthia looked up, confused. What are you saying? Timothy took a deep breath. Marry me. Right now. Tonight. She blinked in disbelief. You're offering to, yes, he interrupted gently. I know it sounds insane. But I've watched you carry burdens you shouldn't have to. I've seen how much this means to you. If there's a way to save it, let's save it. Cynthia's lips parted, but no words came out. But you barely know me. Timothy met her gaze firmly. I know enough. I know you're worth it. I know you care more than anyone else around you. And I know I'd rather see you win than watch people like Gerald take what your father left for you. The silence between them pulsed. Finally, with trembling hands and a heartbroken but brave, Cynthia whispered, okay. Within the hour, a private notary was brought in, papers were signed, and under the golden light of the estate's chapel, with only Lady Marian and the knight as witnesses, Cynthia Kendrick and Timothy Harry were legally wed. No crowds. No music. No fanfare. Just two people, one vow, and a quiet ceremony that changed everything. Cynthia didn't know the full truth about Timothy yet, but something inside her told her this man, this moment, this decision, would not be her downfall. It just might be her deliverance. The early morning light crept through the tall curtains of Cynthia's suite, casting soft golden patterns across the room. She lay in bed, wide awake, her gown replaced by a simple silk robe, and her heart oddly still. The night had not gone how she ever imagined her wedding would, but somehow, it felt more real than anything she had experienced with Daniel. There had been no grand aisle, no chandeliers or violins. Just Timothy, standing tall and honest before her, offering not romance or riches, but solidarity and quiet protection. The papers now filed and stamped sat neatly in a folder on her nightstand, marriage license, inheritance rights secured, and her father's company preserved. She had done it. But as the adrenaline of urgency faded, the reality of it all began to settle around her like mist. She was married. And not to the man she had spent years loving. Downstairs, Timothy stood in the garden courtyard, his jacket off and sleeves rolled up, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He wasn't sure what Cynthia was thinking. He had offered her a lifeline, yes, but he hadn't done it to gain anything. He'd done it because it felt right. Because she deserved a chance to rebuild without watching everything fall apart. And selfishly, perhaps, he wanted to be the man she turned to, even if it was under these strange, unexpected circumstances. He knew she didn't love him. Not yet. But the way she had looked at him last night, through tired, teary eyes, with a flicker of trust, had awakened something deep inside him. Not pity. Not duty. Something far more dangerous, hope. Later that morning, Cynthia came down to the garden in a simple white blouse and trousers, her hair tied back in a loose knot. Timothy stood when he saw her, straightening with instinctive respect. She gave him a small, genuine smile. Thank you, she said softly. He nodded. You don't need to thank me. She studied his face, searching for any sign of hidden motives, but found only sincerity. Most men would have run away from the wreck I was last night. He chuckled. Most men didn't see how strong you were, even when everything was falling apart. She paused, lowering herself onto the bench beside him. I don't know what comes next, Timothy. I didn't plan for any of this. He looked at her, then spoke with a calm that soothed her tired nerves. We figure it out. Day by day. No pressure. Just honesty. That evening, they shared dinner together in the private conservatory, not as bride and groom in love, but as two strangers bound by something deeper than affection, choice. A quiet agreement to stand together in a world that had tried to break them both. The awkwardness melted slowly, conversation flowing easier with each passing hour. They spoke about music, about family, about how they both found comfort in late-night walks. And by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Cynthia laughed for the first time in days, really laughed, the kind that bubbled up from a place she had thought was long buried. Timothy watched her, quietly amazed. Not because she was beautiful, she was, but because in that moment, she was free. The days following the quiet marriage were unlike anything Cynthia had known. The estate, once filled with the noise of preparation and performance, had grown calm, almost reverent. The press had gone wild over Daniel's disappearance, with tabloids speculating everything from a secret affair to an emotional breakdown. Cynthia's PR team released a carefully worded statement. The wedding had been postponed due to personal reasons, and she had requested privacy. But within the walls of Kendrick Estate, life took on a slower rhythm. Cynthia had canceled all meetings for the week. She spent her mornings in the greenhouse, watering orchids her father once adored, and her afternoons walking through the library or sitting under the plum trees with a book she rarely opened. Healing wasn't loud. It was silent, soft, and slow, like stitching torn fabric in the dark. Timothy remained by her side, never intruding, never pressuring. He rose early to join the kitchen staff for breakfast, helped the security team with shifts, and yet always managed to find a way to be nearby whenever Cynthia needed company. They fell into an easy routine, not romantic, but rich with quiet companionship. Some evenings, he would sit beside her in the garden as she sipped tea, and they would talk about mundane things, the stars, her father's favorite books, her dreams of one day opening a charity for women who had been betrayed and abandoned like she had. Timothy listened without offering solutions, and that, more than anything, began to heal her. For the first time in her life, Cynthia didn't feel like she was performing. She didn't have to be strong or beautiful or wise. With him, she was simply allowed to be. One rainy afternoon, she stood by the window of the library watching raindrops race down the glass. Timothy walked in carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate, one of which he placed beside her. "Thought you might like this," he said. She turned to him, smiled, and took a sip. "This is the first time in years I've felt peace," she admitted. "Even when things were perfect on the outside, I was always anxious. But now, everything is broken. And somehow, I feel lighter." Timothy steadied her. "Maybe it's not broken," he said quietly. "Maybe this is what happens when the truth makes space for real healing." She looked at him for a long moment, then reached out and took his hand. It was the first time they had touched with intent. Not obligation. Not accident. But something beginning to bloom. Later that night, Cynthia went to bed and pulled the blanket up to her chin. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about all that had happened. About Daniel. About Rita. About the legacy she had fought so hard to protect. But mostly, she thought about Timothy, the man who had stepped in when everything collapsed, not as a savior, but as a companion. Her husband in name only, yet the only man who had ever truly seen her. And in the quiet of her room, for the first time, Cynthia whispered to herself, "Maybe this wasn't the end of my story. Maybe it was the beginning." The roses in the Kendrick Estate garden were in full bloom, their fragrance drifting through the air like a gentle lullaby. Cynthia stood among them in a soft white sundress, her fingers grazing the petals of a deep crimson bloom. The past few weeks had brought an unfamiliar peace to her world. Gone were the endless meetings, the tight schedules, the expectations. In their place were slow mornings with warm tea, strolls through sun-dappled courtyards, and evenings spent in quiet conversation with Timothy. Though they had married under extraordinary circumstances, Cynthia found herself no longer questioning his presence in her life. He was a constant now, steady, kind, and deeply attentive in ways no man had ever been to her. And without realizing it, she had begun to depend on that presence. They spent much of that day in the garden. Cynthia read beneath the trellis while Timothy watered the flower beds beside her. Their conversations were unhurried, floating from trivial things like favorite foods to deeper topics like legacy and forgiveness. Timothy rarely spoke about his past, and Cynthia never pressed. She sensed there were layers to him, things unspoken, moments lived in silence, but she appreciated the way he focused on her without turning the spotlight to himself. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to perform. She could be vulnerable. She could be strong and soft all at once. She could laugh until she snorted, cry without shame, and sit in complete silence without discomfort. That, she realized, was the most beautiful part of whatever they were building. It was rooted in peace. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, Timothy handed her a single rose he had trimmed from the garden. It was white, delicate, and blooming. "A peace offering," he said with a smile. She tilted her head, amused. "For what?" He shrugged. For all the things I can't say yet. His words hung in the air like a whisper of something unsaid. Cynthia looked at him, eyes searching, trying to read the depth behind that sentence. But instead of pressing him, she accepted the flower and smiled. Then I'll accept it. But just know, I'm not afraid of hard truths. Not anymore. Timothy looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. When the time is right, I'll tell you everything. And that was enough, for now. They sat together as night fell, listening to the cicadas hum and watching stars blink into view one by one. Cynthia rested her head lightly on his shoulder, and he didn't move, afraid that even the smallest shift would break the fragile perfection of the moment. She didn't need grand gestures. She didn't need promises of forever. What she needed, what she cherished, was the feeling that someone finally saw her for who she was and chose to stay. In Timothy's silence, there was honesty. And in Cynthia's presence, there was healing. The rose in her hand was only beginning to bloom, and so was she. It came without warning, though some might say it was long overdue. The headline hit news outlets like a wildfire: Daniel Omok arrested in multi-million-naira fraud scandal. Cynthia saw it first on her tablet as she sipped her morning tea in the garden. Her hand froze mid-air. She tapped the screen, eyes narrowing as the article loaded. Images of Daniel being led in handcuffs into the EFCC headquarters flooded every newsfeed. The article detailed a wide web of fraudulent investment schemes, embezzled corporate funds, and identity theft, some of which had been linked to names within the Kendrick Holdings network. Cynthia's blood ran cold. The betrayal went even deeper than she had known. The man she had once considered her future had used her name, her father's legacy, and her trust as pawns in his game of greed. Rita's name surfaced too, though she had not been arrested, at least not yet. The authorities were investigating her level of involvement, and public opinion quickly turned against her. The same social media users who once envied her now flooded her profiles with venom. Videos surfaced, showing her and Daniel at luxury resorts funded by stolen money. Cynthia watched in silence, not out of spite, but out of yes. But more importantly, I'm your husband. And I've never lied about the most important part of me, my heart. Cynthia didn't speak for several long seconds. She turned, walked toward the glass, and stared out over the city. Her mind spun, not with betrayal, but with awe. He had stood by her during her worst moment, not offering wealth, but presence. And now, he stood before her as a man of power who had chosen humility. When she finally turned back, there were tears in her eyes, but her smile was wide. I don't care how much money you have, she said. You're still the man who handed me tea when I was broken. And that's the man I fell in love with. He stepped forward, and she met him halfway. They kissed, not with the intensity of fantasy, but with the grounding warmth of two souls finally unburdened by secrets. At last, the truth had been unveiled, not just about who Timothy was, but about who they were becoming together. The days that followed moved with the softness of summer rain, gentle, nourishing, full of clarity. The story of Cynthia Kendrick's canceled wedding continued to dominate media headlines, but public sympathy shifted quickly from scandal to admiration. Her grace under pressure, her eloquent address to the board, and her transparency about the ordeal won her respect even from her staunchest critics. Shareholders rallied behind her leadership, affirming her position as CEO. And tucked quietly behind the headlines, a new love story began to blossom, one far more powerful than anything a gossip column could describe. Timothy remained out of the spotlight, as he preferred. But now, with the truth known, his presence beside Cynthia was no longer hidden. He wasn't just a supportive husband, he was her equal in vision, strength, and compassion. Rita did reach out. It came in the form of a handwritten letter, long, apologetic, full of remorse. She begged for forgiveness, blaming desperation, Daniel's manipulation, and her own insecurities. Cynthia read the letter in silence, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer without responding. She didn't need revenge. She didn't even need to hear Rita's voice again. Some betrayals did not require confrontation, they required closure. And Cynthia had found hers in peace, not bitterness. She had no desire to poison her new beginning with memories of pain. Forgiveness, she believed, was something she had already given to herself. The rest no longer mattered. One bright Saturday afternoon, the Kendrick estate reopened its doors, not for a wedding this time, but for a celebration of a different kind. Cynthia and Timothy hosted a charity gala for young women in business, officially launching the Vincent Kendrick Foundation. The gardens were full of laughter, music, and hope. Cynthia gave a powerful speech honoring her father's legacy while announcing the start of her own. Timothy stood beside her, proud, his arm around her waist, no longer the quiet guard in the shadows, but her partner in every way. As she looked out at the guests, she no longer saw eyes filled with judgment. She saw allies. Supporters. People who had watched her fall and rise again, stronger than before. That night, long after the last guest had gone, Cynthia and Timothy sat by the fountain under a sky dusted with stars. He brushed a strand of hair from her face and whispered, "Do you regret any of it?" She looked into his eyes and shook her head. "No. If I hadn't been abandoned, I wouldn't have seen you. If I hadn't been betrayed, I wouldn't have found truth. And if I hadn't lost everything, I wouldn't have learned what love really means." He kissed her gently, and they stayed like that, two people, forged by fire, now resting in the warmth of something real. Not rushed. Not forced. Just a love well earned.